New setup! No, but seriously, I had to film this review later at night rather than, earlier in the day like I normally do. I just had to do some extra lighting, rearrange some things, but, otherwise the review will go on, and I'm just wasting time. We're talking about Fazbear Frights number 4. We're talking about Fazbear Frights number 4, Step Closer. With 3 co-authors this time. I mean, wow. 3 co-authors. I feel so treated. Like, seriously, like, I'm impressed. Okay, alright, enough. Let's just get on with it. Grouchy teenager Pete decides to play a prank on his younger brother by taking him to the back room of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza where resides the defective Foxy. But the encounter seems to affect Pete more than he expected, as he falls victim to a number of suspicious incidents involving his eyes and arm, as prophesized by the piratical singing fox. Can Pete reconcile with his younger brother and throw off the curse in time? Or will he get hit by a bus and have his organs donated against his will? Spoiler alert. This story is another interesting one, and it's probably one of my favorites so far. Reason being is that when I think like what Fazbear Frights should be, which is like FNAF meets Goosebumps, I think you get a story that's very much like Step Closer. I mean, you've got the original animatronics, you've got the mascot pizzeria vibe that most of the other stories were actually like surprisingly lacking. You've got like, an old curse that affects you in like, poetically ironic ways. It feels like it was plucked straight out of Goosebumps story, and I am all here for it. The dynamic between the two brothers was actually pretty solid. I always like that trope where a character has to change their outlook on life because the threat of like harm or death is at their door. It's almost as if some greater force is saying, there's so much more to this crazy world than to be petty. Stuff like that, I really like. Good stuff. I like how the incidents were a mix of things that were complete accidents and also completely Pete's fault. Like, yeah, on one hand you have a fish hook like snagging him in the eye, and on the other hand, you trespass like behind a meat counter with like swinging blades and hanging hooks and all that. So, I mean, yeah, you deserve to get your hand cut off, dude. Side note, but Foxy really seems to be like a standout animatronic compared to the rest. I think it's because like everyone from the general fans to Scott Cawthon himself seems to like recognize there's like this unique menace to Foxy. Probably because he's like the most like conventionally scary of the original characters. So it was good to see a full story dedicated to him. It's near the ending though where things start to fizzle out, unfortunately. There's this really botched moment, so few of those in this series, I know, where Pete is running back to the pizzeria to try and like rectify things once and for all, and he gets hit by a bus. Now, it's not the plot point that gets me, it's the way it's written. Like, this sudden, violent, traumatic like event is conveyed in the most like cut and dry paragraph ever conceived in the history of fiction. I get that the actual nature of the accident is sudden, but this wasn't even a scene. It was like a SparkNotes summary of a scene. I mean, just baffling. The final nail in the coffin for poor Pete is when the doctors think he's dead, so they start removing his organs even when he's still alive, so he has to like witness like everything inside him getting taken out before his eyes, which are also taken. Okay, that was kind of funny. Firstly, the foreshadowing for this twist was like complete, utter darkness. The shadows were so thick. And unfortunately, the gravity of the scene was diminished by the fact that I saw this exact same scenario in a TV show called 1,000 Ways to Die, which I remember being like the most well-produced schlock like ever put on television. I totally get why people would find this scenario disturbing, and it is disturbing, but just for me personally, just all I kept thinking of was 1,000 Ways to Die, and it just took me out of the story, unfortunately. But otherwise, Step Closer was really solid. Not quite as good as Lonely Freddy. I mean, the lackluster ending is mostly to blame for that, but still, yeah, I enjoyed it very much. I mean, probably the most, like, Fazbear Frights-esque book of them all so far, the whole FNAF meets Goosebumps thing. Good stuff, good stuff. Next. Casey is a street rat who gets by stealing people's purses and wallets. But upon stealing a goodie bag from a patron of a Circus Baby's Pizza World, she discovers a pair of novelty glasses that, when you put them on, it reveals Ballora dancing in the distance. And for every time you put them on afterwards, she seems to be dancing closer. The approaching menace coincides with the unbearable guilt that weighs Casey down and seems to follow her wherever she goes. Immediately I saw parallels between Dance With Me and Stephen King's The Sun Dog. In that story, there's a Polaroid camera that, with every picture taken, there's a mysterious dog that appears in the distance, and with every picture that's taken afterwards, it seems to run closer and closer towards the viewer. Unlike Dance With Me, however, The Sun Dog is actually good. Yeah, this one had a lot of parallels with 1:35 a.m. The sympathetic female protagonist at the forefront, being stalked by something that she doesn't quite understand, and that thing ultimately not proving to have the requisite bite. Sure, Casey has nightmares, and sure, Ballora keeps getting closer every time she puts on the glasses, and sure, she tries running away as a form of atonement, and that's about the whole story. Unlike 1:35 a.m., which had a suitably horrific ending, this one kinda ends with an anticlimax. Casey ends up tracking down the family whom she stole from, and she gives the glasses back to the little girl, who puts them on and is overjoyed that she can finally see Ballora dancing again. So, does this mean the little girl also had some demons that only a cross-country road trip with Ballora could vanquish? Or were the glasses truly just a novelty item and Casey was just scaring herself with guilt this whole time? Most likely the latter. And sure, there's a nice message about, like, guilt forcing us to construct imaginary monsters, but the story preceding it is just so, like, lackluster and familiar that this kinda sorta twist just unfortunately made me roll my eyes. That's about it with this one. Wasn't really a fan. Ballora can go dance off a cliff and out of my subpar YA horror lit. Next! Coming Home stars two girls named Samantha and Susie, the latter of whom is a ghost! But in all seriousness, this is the same Susie that's actually possessing, like, the original Five Nights at Freddy's Chica, and she keeps returning to her home to try and send her sister a message about the location of her missing doll. Meanwhile, Samantha balances her difficult social life and her depressed mother, while the mysterious messages and the threat of Chica actually visiting her house loom over her like a shade. This is another interesting one. Unlike Step Closer, which really felt like a FNAF meets Goosebumps kind of thing, this one felt like it was plucked, like, straight from the games. Like, it was actually kind of cool. There's a few cosmetic differences between, like, this Susie and the Susie in the games, but I mean, overall, the fundamental concept is pretty similar. I will say that it was a bit confusing initially as to the nature of Susie. We don't immediately learn that she's a ghost. The fact that she's murdered is dropped about a third of the way through the book, but the way Susie acts is almost like she doesn't realize she's dead either. But later it's confirmed that Susie already knew she was a ghost, and that her seemingly unself-aware observations of the family ignoring her are just the way she sees the world. Which is kinda sweet, kinda sad, but just initially confusing. The story's alright, kinda slow, kinda bleak. There's, like, symbolism about dolls and trees that is pretty familiar. Chica showing up at the house every night and actually being an active threat towards Samantha at one point, that was pretty cool. But everything wraps up, a happy ending. As happy as a story about a murdered little girl can be, so. Not much else to say, let's move on to the Stitch Wraith. So I learned that there's actually, like, two entities inside the Stitch Wraith. There's Jake, who seems like the innocent, like, peacemaking kind, and then there's Andrew, who's just like a malevolent force that, like, infects whatever, like, metal pieces and robotics it seems to touch. This entry was more like an introductory piece than anything, so all it's doing is making me even more excited for the Stitch Wraith saga. I'm seriously wondering, like, why the whole thing just wasn't released as its own book, as it's leagues more, like, interesting and, like, better structured than, like, most of the stories I've read here. Speaking of which, I've read 4 of these already. That's a lot of progress. How many more are there again? 8? Y'all better keep watching these videos.